Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. We are live for our third quarantine Q&A with Dr. O episode. I feel like I'm on a TV show. Can I check if you can hear me? Can someone please type, yes, we can hear you, so that I can talk freely. I'm going to go on the assumption that you can hear me, and I'm going to start sharing the usual introduction, just to make sure that those who are new to these sessions can also have a little bit of context. So my name is Dr. Oberdan Marianetti. The way in which we're going to have this 1 hour together is structured in 3 parts. The first part, which I'm doing now, is the introduction, where I want to tell you a little bit about the quarantine Q&A with Dr. O. And thank you, Elia. I know now you guys can hear me. Wonderful. A little bit about the session, why we're doing this, a little bit about me. The second part is a centering exercise, which basically is a 5-minute stretch to be in silence with ourselves, with our breath, part of which I will guide, part of which will be in silence, to help us get into the session and away from whatever we have behind us this day, this week, this month. And then the third part, the Q&A, where I get to address the questions that I see in the chat, and just speak freely about what comes up in relation to those topics or anything that I feel is relevant and that might help you. So let me get going with the introduction. The reason why I started the quarantine Q&A with Dr. O about 3 weeks ago, no, exactly 3 weeks ago now, 2 weeks ago, because there was an individual and a collective desire. The individual desire was I wanted to feel a little bit more helpful. I had been reading news articles and videos left, right, and center about the effort our healthcare practitioners are making in basically all around the world to care for those affected by the COVID-19. And I'm a healthcare practitioner, and I wasn't out there doing volunteering work and whatever. Yes, I'm still doing my work. I'm still seeing my clients online, but I felt the desire to do more. And so this, in a way, served that individual purpose. And the second collective purpose is the knowledge through the stories I'm hearing with my clients that out there's a very broad experience in relation to the lockdown, the quarantine, the COVID-19 itself, people having friends, relatives, or family members affected by the virus itself, and realizing that it doesn't matter what's the spectrum in which you find yourself, having a great experience being at home with your kids, family, partner, whatever, or having a terrible experience, feeling isolated, maybe your mental health issues being exacerbated. I thought there was an opportunity to help anybody who in these very unusual circumstances might have unanswered questions and might not have access to someone who could provide those answers. So feel free to type anything you want in the chat in relation to your experience of the quarantine, in the lockdown, and I will address it as best as I can, given my knowledge, my experience, and my interpretation. And for those of you who don't know me, my background is a mixture, but primarily I'm sitting here as a mental health practitioner and a Wim Hof Method instructor. And the knowledge and the inputs I will be sharing with you come from those two angles, with the two being integrated in the way I approach my work. So my academic background, I'm a psychologist, and I'm also a clinical sexologist, and I'm based in Singapore, and I work with clients on a broad range of questions and topics, from marital to individual mental health and sexual related matters. And with the Wim Hof part of my work, I've created practices and techniques that are from the Wim Hof method to help my clients recenter, deal with stress, deal with fears, deal with anxieties, and ultimately have a better life. So if you want to find out more about my work or the Wim Hof method, or how I've integrated the psychology and the Wim Hof method into a unique proposition, check the description of the video. You'll find the links there. So that's a little bit about why we're doing this, and a little bit about who I am, so I know why I'm sitting here sharing this with you. And I'd like to move to the 5 minutes centering exercise. Same as last week, we're going to do it very simple. We're going to take a 5 minutes break. I will use a timer so that we can all stick to the time. And in the first part, I'll describe a little bit what we do. But basically, we are going quietly within ourselves, using the tool of our breath to try and stay centered and slow things down. At the end of the 5 minutes, you will hear a gong. I hope you can hear it through the microphone, but I'll let you know anyway. And then we can start addressing your questions in the Q&A. All right, I'll start the timer now. There it goes. And we begin by noticing whatever position we're in. Some of you might be sitting down. Some of you might be lying down. Whatever it is, just notice the support you have under your body. If it's the chair, notice the pressure of your feet on the ground. Notice your legs supported by the chair and your back supported by the back of the chair. And if you're lying down, noticing the surface on which you're lying down, whether it's soft, whether it's hard, warm or cold. Whatever the case, just noticing that there's something there to support you, and then you can let go to that support. At least for the next few minutes, you can trust that it's going to be there. You can trust that it's going to look after your body. And with that knowledge, you can also begin to breathe more consciously, with your eyes open or closed, up to you, totally a preference. Breathing in deeply and letting go a slow, continuous exhale. Breathing in deeply and letting go on a long, slow exhale. As you breathe in, noticing whether you're breathing in through your nose or through your mouth. Noticing if the air touching your skin is warm or cold. Following the air as it enters your body, it travels down through your neck, into your lungs, and it gives you that expanding sensation. filling up your lungs, but without force, and then letting go with a nice slow exhale. Again, noticing whether it's coming out of your nose or coming out of your mouth. Noticing if the breath is being pushed from down below in the belly or up top in the chest. Whatever it is, just keep noticing your breath. And if you find it difficult to follow the details of what I just described in your breath, perhaps you can just try to count your breath. Bringing one breath in all the way to the top. And all the way to the bottom, making it one count. Just keep counting. I'll leave you to be in silence now and just follow your breath whichever way feels comfortable to you. Allow this to be an opportunity to break away from the day behind you so that we can spend the next hour together centered, open, curious, and connected in whichever way this technology allows us to. That is the timer, which means I spoke for a lot longer than I imagined I was. I'll have to work on that. So we can move on to the third and final part of this session, which is the Q&A, answering your questions. And I will be going off of what's written in the chat, which is on the right on my screen, which is why I keep pointing there. And I'll work with whatever questions comes as best as I can. So I can see there's a question posted which says, after 2 months of strict lockdown, the thought to be free to go out into the world as soon as possible scares me so much, and I don't know how to overcome this fear. Okay. I want to start with a little bit of a, let's call it a silly analogy or joke. I don't know what to call it. But once upon a time, I heard that fear was actually the acronym for something to describe fear itself. And the acronym was FEAR, which stands for fake evidence appearing real. Fake evidence appearing real. And I remember when I first heard it, I was like, wow, that's such a nice way of encapsulating some of the concepts that revolve around fear. So perhaps I'm going to answer that question starting from fear itself, so that hopefully we can understand what it is and what we can do about it, specifically, as the question suggests, in the context of re-entering the world after lockdown. So let's begin with the idea that fear is good. Is good as a tool, is good in the function it provides. Like every other emotion that we experience, it has a very good role to play in the way we exist. It is something that we have. It is something that we have developed in our history as human beings, and that we could argue has developed to keep us alive. And broadly speaking, I would say that there are two types of fears. There are the rational fears and the irrational fears. So if I told you, is it useful to be scared of fire? Then I think you can imagine why the answer would be yes, because if you got yourself burnt at some point as a little kid, the fear you then developed from the pain that emerges keeps you away from that fire in the future. If I asked you whether it's useful to be scared of a scary man wielding a knife in front of you asking for your wallet, perhaps an example we don't encounter every day, but you get the picture. There are fears that are useful to us, that is rational and understandable and acceptable to have as part of our repertoire of how we, engage and respond to life. Then there are fears that are not so useful. And so perhaps the fear that if I leave my room and I step into the outside world, something horrendous is going to happen to me, might not be as useful a fear. Is there a chance that that might happen to me? Yes, for certain. Is the likelihood that it might happen to me such that it's justifiable for me to create that as a rational fear? Probably not. If I fear that along my way to this holiday destination while I'm driving, there might be tunnels, and if I step into a tunnel, I might have an adverse reaction to it and all of a sudden create a car accident, is also another type of fear that might not be as useful. Might be justified in why it has been created in our minds, and I think I'll speak a little bit about that in a moment, but it's not a rational fear that we can entertain as a strictly useful tool for our survival at its most basic. So let's distinguish the two fears for a moment and focus on the idea that re-entering the world and feeling a sense of deep, deep fear. I think the words were scares me so much. Yes, so deep, deep fear might fall close or fully in the irrational category. So why might this be happening? And most importantly, how do we deal with it? Starting from the assumption that a fear has a useful function, when we have experiences that traumatize us one way or another, and we can talk about big traumas or we can talk about small traumas, little things that are present in our lives that create a response that is negative within us and that immediately create fear. There might have been a point in your life when a similar event has created an imprint in your mind that was big enough for your brain to conclude that anything that resembles it is scary and should not be entertained. So I'll give you an example. Imagine I'm a little toddler and that my parents have taken me to a park to just enjoy the park and the open air. Now I'm a toddler, I'm still not walking, and I might be crawling on the grass, just gingerly playing around, being a toddler. And all of a sudden, a puppy who sees from the distance another four-legged animal, in this case a baby, runs towards me thinking, oh, there's a playmate, we're gonna have fun. Now I'm a little baby on the ground, I'm at eye level with the puppy who's now running towards me. It would be justifiable if my little unexperienced or inexperienced brain thought, oh my God, I'm being attacked by a giant beast. And so I might get a reaction like freezing and then starting to cry, or maybe trying to run away on my four-legged version of being a human back to my parents. But at that point, my brain might have created an association that beasts that look like that are dangerous. Fast forward 30 years, you're now a grown-up man, in this case me, given that I'm using an example of me, and I might be walking in the park alone, just nice, gingerly walk, and all of a sudden a dog starts running towards me. I might not be able to recognize if the dog is wagging its tail playfully or whether it's running at me with drawn teeth, because perhaps seeing the dog running towards me is sufficient for my brain to open up the box of when I first imprinted that picture of the dog, and terror literally coming at me. Now, rationally, if we observe this picture from the outside, it wouldn't make sense for me to react that way. I'm a big grown man. The dog is probably, let's say, a mid-sized dog. I could do something about it. I could shout at it. I could take a stick and do something about it. I could just wait and see or assess if the dog is in a friendly mode or in an attack mode. But when you are flooded with these emotions of fear, you can't do that. Your brain is switched off. You have now been taken over by an imprinted reaction, an emotional one, that is basically dictating that you have to either fight, flight, or freeze. You have to survive, and those are your only option. This would be the equivalent of a mechanism that we have adopted in prehistory, literally to survive. And again, I'm going to give you another analogy. Imagine you and I are in the woods hunting for the food for the evening. And all of a sudden, a saber-toothed tiger is approaching us at speed. If we were to use intellect and stop and start pondering, what do you think about this saber-toothed tiger? Right? It's like 30 meters away, approaching fast. We couldn't use our cognition to assess the situation, because in that moment of danger, if that's the tool of our choice, we'd be gone. The tiger would have already made a meal of ourselves. So in this situation, we have been inbuilt with processes that switch off cognition, switch off intellect, take over with automatic responses that get us to react. And the typical response in situations of danger is, as I mentioned, fight, flight, or freeze. Now, when this mechanism is activated, a lot of physical changes take place. The pupil dilation changes, our heart rate starts to raise, the kidneys, which on top have something called adrenal glands, begin to pump stress hormones into the system, namely adrenaline and cortisol, which are basically designed to ready the body physically to run as fast as you can, to fight as hard as you can, or to freeze and pretend to be dead in the hope that the animal leaves you alone. So far, all good, because this is all normal. Fast forward to our modern life. The mechanism is still exactly the same as our ancestors. The problem is we no longer have saber-toothed tigers around the world any longer. And therefore, we don't need to use that mechanism for that level of intensity of stressors, of threats, of dangers. What we have replaced it with is daily, tiny, ongoing, omnipresent, low-grade stressors, which obviously are also added with big spikes of stress now and again in moments of big change. It doesn't matter what it is, but it could be positive or negative. They can be stressful. But we've replaced much of that with those low-grade, omnipresent stressors, which activate our nervous system in a way that makes us feel as we are always under threat. And so you might be walking around the world with this idea that, hey, the world is a dangerous place. I better keep an eye on things because I might be attacked at any moment by a mugger, by an unfriendly boss, by my bitchy colleague, whatever the case might be. But the idea that I'm trying to present is that we have created certain conditions in modern life that have made fear or the activation of the stress response, which can be caused by fear or create a sense of fear, keeping constantly on. So, this being a little bit of a context and wanting to come back to the question, what can we do about it? Number one, if a system in fear is one that has already been activated in a stressful way, physically finding ways to lower that stress, physically finding ways to down-regulate the nervous system response from a stress response to a relaxed response is a first sure way of slowing things down, of lowering the feelings of anxiety and fear that might be coming with whatever the situation, and gaining a little bit of a sense of control. One way to do this, we have been doing for the last 3 episodes, is the breathing exercise that I ask you to do at the beginning. Now, without going into the details of the mechanisms and the science behind it, but we know that when you take an in-breath and put oxygen into your system, you are activating the part of the nervous system that accelerates things, that gets you ready to perform and fight and flight or freeze. When you instead are taking a slow and long exhale out of your body, you are lowering down the stress response by activating the part of the nervous system that does that. I want you to imagine that there's 2 pedals in the nervous system. There's one pedal called the sympathetic nervous system, which is the accelerator. This is when threats come your way, when you've got too much going on, when something happened, boom, the foot goes on, system gets activated because you need to get ready to react, perform, do something. The second one is the brake, which we call the parasympathetic nervous system, and that is the one in charge of bringing everything back down once the threat has disappeared. So we're in the woods, we've won over the battle with the saber-toothed tiger, we finished our hunting, we're back in the cave, now it's safe, system naturally slows down. Problem is, in modern life, we never go back to the cave. We never relax. We never step out of those stressors. We are constantly bombarded by them. So, physically, step number 1, regaining control of your nervous system, is a way of handling your fears by slowing down the nervous system, regaining a sense of centeredness, regaining a sense of control, and getting yourself ready for the next step, which is facing your fears. So once you've gained a physical state where you're able to understand and reason and see things a little bit more from the distance, like, for example, me and the dog, now that I'm centered a little bit, I'm not overwhelmed by the situation, I'm able to see, oh, okay, the dog is wagging its tail, his face is friendly, I'm not under threat. I can do that because I'm not flooded by emotions, and I can therefore assess my fear in a more realistic manner. And so I might, for example, be in the car driving towards my holiday destination, and I know in 2 kilometers that long tunnel is coming up. So I can do my breathing, and I can stay centered to the fact that it's just a tunnel. I've got the lights in the car. I can put the lights on the right beam, and I've got people in the car keeping me company. Maybe I can ask them something about the situation to keep me centered, to keep me present. so that I can face my fear and realize that perhaps it's not as big as I imagined it to be in that irrational part of my mind, where the script is dictated by something that gets triggered in me that I might not even be aware of. So, on the immediate, to answer Elia's question, using relaxation techniques, and the breathing exercise I mentioned is just one of them, to center the body and slow the nervous systems down, gives you the opportunity to regain that little bit more of your cognitive intellectual power that hopefully then helps you for the second step, which is to face your fear, look at your fear in a little bit more objective manner rather than flooded by emotions with all the meaning that you therefore attach to it. Over the longer term, so not on the immediate moment of the threat potentially arising, we also know very well that a healthy body goes with a healthy mind, and this includes handling fears and anxieties and depression. Excuse me. Which means that eating well, resting well, exercising can all give you a better connection with yourself, physically, psychologically, emotionally, which then gives you access to better understanding of who you are in relation to those situations that cause those fears, and therefore gives you the opportunity to assess whether you have a genuine fear, no, there's fire there, I know I'm going to get burned if I'm not careful, versus an irrational fear where the darkness of a tunnel I'm about to drive in might not be as big a threat as I imagine it to be. And so to wrap it all up, my recommendation and suggestion for you, Elia, is that the day you are about to re-enter the world because the country you're in has lowered the lockdown and it's now safe to go out, to stay centered with what you are experiencing, to take it slowly, to do what you feel comfortable with, but to make sure that you continue acting, that you don't feel paralyzed by that fear enough to decide not to go out, because it tends to have a snowball effect. And if you then begin to stop yourself from doing healthy things because your fear feels so great, you might end up doing less and less and less and less, and eventually creating a really big fear that paralyzes you from, for example, going out in public altogether. It's called agoraphobia. But the point is learning to face our fears in as objective a manner as possible by lowering the stress response when we feel it would be one recommendation. A very long-winded one, but I hopefully I've explained a little bit also the mechanisms of how these fears are being created in response to stressors, and therefore what you can do both physically and mentally. Okay, I see a couple more items there. In Singapore, the COVID has lately hit a lot of the community of workers who live in dormitories and do all sorts of works that locals would not want to do. I have to apologize, but I forgot my glasses in the other room and the writing is a little small, so forgive me if I'm taking a little bit longer to see what it says. And then the second part, it says, in general, these people are not too literate. What type of psychological support do you think they would need, and how this could be provided to them? Thank you. Wow, what an interesting question. So, for those of you who are not in Singapore and are not familiar with the situation, the country had COVID well under control up until, I believe, about a month ago. At which point the COVID spread within a community where migrant workers live, where the living conditions are very packed and sometimes in very difficult conditions. And so, because these tend to be closed communities, literally where the compounds where these migrant workers are housed, being closed compounds, closed communities, it began to spread really, really, really quickly. And so we were at a point where we had in the 1 or 2 digit new cases daily. And since it spread into these communities, we've been having hundreds of new cases daily. And the government has stepped in and has done a lot of work to help manage the situation and changing and readdressing the conditions of the dormitories and the compounds, splitting the healthy workers from the ones who were tested positive, and doing a lot of interventions to basically manage the situation and keep them as safe as possible, while addressing those who have been affected. Now, that being the context, the question I think is a very pertinent one, because the migrant workers in Singapore who are here from countries like Bangladesh and India, Pakistan, China, and so on and so forth, come here to look for work that affords them the possibility to then have a life here as a worker and then support their families back at home, who often don't have access to much in many ways. So to them, this is a really important role they play in their community at home and for what they are able to provide. Now, the reality of these communities is that they are quite isolated from the rest of society in many, many ways. Number one, as I've already explained, they literally live in compounds that usually their employers provide, from which they are ferried back and forth to work, and where a lot of their life revolves. So physically, they are already distanced somewhat from the rest of everyday life interactions in the rest of the country. The second dimension that I believe makes them somewhat isolated and distanced is that the type of works these workers do, and the question also alluded to work that locals would not want to do, are the types of work that are very manual in nature: building roads, building the underground system, roofing, building, this type of labor. And the type of salaries that they get are not so high, which therefore means they haven't got much spending power in Singapore, being, if I recall correctly, last year was voted the most expensive city in the world. Or maybe it was Hong Kong. Anyway, it's certainly up there. So why am I giving you all this context? Because mental health services privately offered tend to be rather expensive. And so very, very often, and this is true in all countries, not just in Singapore, unless there is a strong presence of the state in offering subsidized mental health services, there isn't much that people in the lower social economic layers of society can purchase when it comes to mental health services. So I'm starting from the presupposition, given the question, that unfortunately many of these migrant workers do not have access to private services for mental health. However, there is a system here, part of the health system that the country provides, that does include mental health services. So my first answer to the question would be that for those migrant workers, and I would say for everybody else in the country who is willing to engage mental health providers and might not be able to afford them privately, going to the hospitals and through the local system would indeed provide them support as necessary. The second piece, which I think we've been seeing in the news recently, and again, this is specific to Singapore, is that many mental health colleagues and many health colleagues, not mental health, just health practitioners, have been volunteering at the communities of migrant workers, either directly on site or being made available by institutions in places that migrant workers can access. And then, so that would be a second channel. And the third one, I believe, comes down to community. And I mean community in a multi-layered sense. One, the community that the migrant workers themselves occupy. And so my hope is that within their compounds, within their community of friends and social connections locally, that there is an ongoing sharing and connecting and engaging socially and emotionally, albeit following the rules of social distancing, etc., that allows them to feel that they're not facing these alone. But I also mean community in the broader sense of the word. And so if there is something that you feel individually, Laura was asking the question, that you, Laura, feel the desire to do individually, I remember that there is a website, and I don't recall the URL in Singapore, but there's a website in Singapore, if I remember correctly, where you can actually browse for all of the current volunteering opportunities that are available from the various institutions that manage them, where they've not been able to yet find volunteers. And so that could be one channel to explore how you might be able to contribute directly. And then, even if their website is from a different country, I honestly don't remember. I know there's such a thing, and I'm almost certain I've heard of it in Singapore. But even if it's not, just a search for volunteering opportunities on the internet in Singapore to do with the migrant workers community, I'm absolutely certain would yield opportunities. And then the final community meaning of the word that's coming to mind for me is the faith community. And so whether it is the Christian community, the Buddhist community, the Hindu community, the Islamic community, there would be groups within the faith communities that have involved themselves actively to support. So I don't believe we are short of opportunities to help, whether it's the migrant workers or other people at large during this situation, including your neighbor might be struggling and just sending a letter through the post, or I don't know, something can be done, I'm sure. So just reach out to look for ways that you can contribute to whatever skills, tools, or resources you have access to, and I'm sure it would be deeply appreciated. Okay, I can see that the next two entries are just thank yous, and thank you for being grateful, but I don't see any other questions. We have 15 minutes till the end of the session, and I'm wondering whether there's any burning questions that I can address for you, or otherwise I can, I'm sure, elaborate on some of the things that have come up. Perhaps one thing I will say in the meantime is that I noticed after last week's session that I actually did miss one question in the chat. Now, even though, as you can see, the chat is not buzzing with questions and comments one after the other. I'm quite new to this technology. It's the third time, literally, that I use it. And sometimes I get taken by the things I'm saying and I lose track of what's being said there. So yes, I wanted to apologize to the person who submitted the question last week, and I completely missed it and realized it wasn't addressed. Now, I wish I remember what the question was. I could address it now, but I didn't make a note of that, and I only just thought of it. So that would be all I can say about that. Perhaps I'll elaborate a little bit more on the part I was sharing at the beginning, and the idea of our body and our minds being constantly bombarded by these low-grade stressors that basically keep us constantly with a sense of unease or anxiety or discomfort of some kind or another. If you look around, we are constantly demanded to be attentive to one thing or another. Earlier I mentioned some examples, like it could be a boss, it could be a partner, it could be a child. But the truth is, those are the obvious stimuli that come our way and grab our attention. But there are an enormous amount of stimuli around us that take our attention, whether we realize it or not. A classic example is TV, and specifically within TV, advertising. And indeed, a much broader spectrum of what advertising is, because it's everywhere. It's on TV, it's on the internet, it's on YouTube, it's on the billboards on the street. And the idea is that we don't realize, but it takes our attention. And I want to relate to you an experiment that was done many years ago with children to demonstrate the power of advertising and to basically confirm what advertisers have known forever, which is that their task is that of making sure people feel inadequate. Why do I say that? And it might sound a little controversial, and if there are some advertisers on the call today, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But the idea of the experiment was very simple. If we put a child before a choice that psychologically is quite obvious which one is the healthier one of the two, would the child make the right choice, i.e. the healthy one, when we introduce an advert? So the experiment was very simple. A group of children, was shown an advert about toy X, whatever the toy is, it doesn't matter. And then was shown another advert about the same toy. And a group of children was shown no advert. Then the children were all asked the same thing. Dear child, now that you've watched this, you have the option to go and play with child A, who I have to tell you is a little bit mean and frustrating and annoying and arrogant, but he has the toy that you just saw in the ad. Or you can go and play with child B, who's a lovely child, very friendly, very warm, very empathic, but he doesn't have the toy. And I think you know where I'm going with this, because what the experimenters found is that most of the kids chose to play with the child with the toy, even though they were told the child they were going to play was a mean kid. So psychologically, they took the choice that knowingly or unbeknowingly was going to be of negative impact for them, because of the power of what the toy made them realize. And so the example of advertising, and it comes in so many forms, that means we have 10 minutes left. is a narrative that is always the same. Hey, Oberdan, look here. I know you want to be feeling good about yourself, and you want to look healthy, and you want to this, that, and the other. And you really could if you buy this pen. You know, you don't really quite meet the standard without this that can give you this, that, and the other. So why don't you come and join me and buy the pen to be cool like all of the people who have the pen? Now, if you don't mind, you'll need to part with a few dollars, but this will give you that and will make you feel cool. So come, join. The narrative is the same across the board, which is driving us constantly to not feel good enough, to not feel adequate, to not meet the standard of how I look and how I feel. And believe it or not, even if you don't realize it, even if you're not paying attention to those ads are designed in a way to catch your attention and to actually make you feel inadequate so that you go spend those money. And so one thing that I'm alerting you to, an additional thing, is that if you want to lower those ongoing stressors, one way of doing it, especially in this time of COVID, where we're bombarded with news and videos about the pandemic, is to be mindful of what you consume. It's so easy nowadays to look at one news article, and before you know it, you've diverged into 10 rabbit holes, each taking you deeper and deeper into understanding this, being curious about that. Before you know it, you've spent an hour consuming information that is impacting you. Some of it is good because it's information you might need to make decisions, but a lot of it is not good. And it is, in fact, impacting the way you respond to life and to these constant demands. I see there's a question that came in. Good evening, Oberdan. How would you help a client who has difficulty realizing that the lockdown will at some stage, hopefully soon, be over? He doesn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, so the question is, how would you help someone who is basically in denial and doesn't want to accept that the lockdown will be over? Now, the fact that, Alexander, you are calling this person a client, I'm assuming you might be working in a capacity as a coach or a therapist of some kind. And so I'm going to answer it from that angle. I would seek to understand the motivations for which this person is currently so attached to the lockdown being here, and by the sound of it, seeing it as eternal, or maybe hoping that is eternal. I would seek to understand what are the drivers that have created the attachment, and similarly, linking to the sharing I did earlier about the previous questions, I would seek to understand also what the fears might be in accepting that there is going to be a life post-lockdown and that we are going to be mingling with others, perhaps not in the same way we did before, certainly not when it comes to international travel, certainly not before a few months, but I would seek to understand those motivations so that I could figure out if there are any levers that this person has, really clung on, that are making them so convinced that there is no post-lockdown life. This is normality. That would be my 2 pennies worth input without additional context. If there's any follow-up on what I just said, or if you want to clarify a little bit more the context, by all means, please write something, and I'd be happy to address it accordingly. But yes, in a nutshell, I'd be curious to understand the reasons and the motivations behind their desire to believe there's no lockdown and what fears might exist post-lockdown. Okay, a few minutes left, and let me scroll. Is there any questions? No other questions coming in. Maybe I'll take it as an opportunity to wrap things up, and if there's anything else coming in the meantime, that's welcome too. How would I want to wrap up? I guess 3 sessions in, this is the 3rd time we do this. I feel more encouraged every time. And I can assure you that I had my own fears in doing this, in offering it first and then actually doing it. And there's all these fears around, will people show up? Will I say things of value? How will I know I'm not talking to anybody? What if it's all rubbish and it's adding no value? Things like that. I mentioned to you at the beginning that the reason I'm doing it, the personal reason I'm doing it, is because I want to feel I'm doing something more, I'm contributing beyond what I do with my work. And so those irrational fears were there for me. And I guess my approach was, you know what? I'm offering it. It's there. My voice is going to be broadcasted by this amazing technology that we have been given. And it will land on many terrains. Many of these terrains, it will land on blind and deaf ears. It won't resonate, it won't matter, it will add no value, and they most likely will ignore it. But if it reaches enough people, and within all of those landing places, there are a few of them, just a few, that can take something useful out of these conversations, one-way conversations mostly, and I promise you it's not easy for someone who likes to interact with people, then it would have been worthy of the effort I put. And if what I say to some people is rubbish, so be it. I'm speaking from my heart. I'm offering what I can from my knowledge and my skills and my experiences and whatever. And it'll be what it needs to be. So I was able to let go of the irrational fear and say, who cares? I'll do it anyway. It'll be whatever it needs to be. I can see that there's a follow-up. Great, thanks. I had worked with him for 8 months to ease his social isolation. And just when he was ready to get out and about, lockdown measures were imposed. Oh, I see. So this is someone who was already experiencing social anxiety and absolutely, I can understand the setback. So the end of the statement says he was ready to get out and about, and lockdown measures were imposed. This has been a major setback. Yeah, I can absolutely understand. What comment would I make to that might be useful? Well, just off the cuff, on the spot like this, it's difficult, but what comes to mind is that if you had already been working with this person for 8 months on their seeming inability to go out and interact socially, then what I would say is that maybe it's not the lockdown itself that can be the focus of inquiry. But I would still wonder, it's not clear from your chat inputs, I would still wonder more about the motivations for staying isolated. And you might obviously have inquired about it at length in the 8 months you've worked together. But I always like to look at the two sides of the medal. And with the question being framed around the lockdown, initially I thought maybe the fear is in what's out there, but I'm wondering also personally, what's the motivation and what's the liking of isolation that might also begin to explain the interaction between the two. That second sound brings us to the end of the hour. I want to thank every single one of you for participating and posting your questions and your comments. Obviously, this being a Q&A, it would not exist without your comments and your questions, so I really appreciate those. Please share this channel. No, it's not the channel. Forget about the channel. This session with your friends and family. We will meet again next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Singapore time. I will share the link for the specific session on the usual platforms. But if you don't have the link to share with a friend, just go on YouTube, look for Oberdan Marianetti, and the live upcoming session will be there once it has been created. So even without the link, you can always find it, even at the last minute. Thank you very much again, and I wish you all a wonderful week, and I look forward to interact with you again next week. Bye-bye.